They told me I had a problem with authority. They were right. But nobody warned me that my sharp tongue would one day find its deadliest target in a man whose smile could promise heaven while his hand signed death warrants. The fluorescent lights of Bellini's buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the pristine white tablecloths that I'd spend the next 3 hours keeping spotless. At 24, I'd become an expert at swallowing my pride along with the bitter coffee we served to people who treated service workers like furniture. My reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine showed a woman who'd learned to bite her tongue until it bled. But tonight, that hard-won restraint would shatter like fine crystal hitting marble floor. The restaurant occupied the corner of Fifth and Madison, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that most people only saw in postcards. Bellini's wasn't just expensive, it was exclusive. The kind of place where reservations required 6 weeks' notice and a credit check. I'd been working there for 8 months, long enough to recognize the hierarchy that existed beyond the printed menu. The regular customers who got the best tables, the ones whose wine glasses never sat empty, the ones whose displeasure could cost you more than your tip. I was refilling water glasses at table 7 when he walked in. The room didn't exactly go silent, but something shifted, a collective holding of breath. The maitre d', Tony, a man who treated dignity like armor, actually straightened his already perfect posture. Through the kitchen doors, I caught the head chef's face going pale. Even the sommelier, who normally moved with the confidence of someone who knew his wines better than his own children, seemed to shrink slightly. The man at the center of this invisible disturbance looked like he'd stepped out of an advertisement for watches that cost more than my annual salary. Dark suit tailored so perfectly it might have been sewn onto his body. Hair styled with just enough casual disarray to suggest he hadn't tried, though I suspected every strand had been carefully considered. His eyes swept the room with the kind of assessment that made you feel catalogued, evaluated, and either approved or dismissed in a single glance. He was younger than I expected, maybe 32 or 33, with the kind of face that photographers probably fought over. But there was something else beneath the surface beauty. Something cold and calculating that made my instincts scream danger even as my pulse kicked up for entirely different reasons. Tony materialized at his side with the speed of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. They exchanged words I couldn't hear, but I watched Tony's gestures, the way he indicated the entire restaurant as if offering it as tribute. The man's response was brief, barely a nod, before Tony led him toward the private dining room in the back, the one we kept. Reserved even when we claimed to be fully booked. The room that regular customers couldn't buy their way into no matter how much money they offered. I should have stayed away. Should have stuck to my assigned tables and pretended I hadn't noticed the strange electricity that had charged the air when he arrived. But the private dining room was technically still my section, and I needed this job too much to let someone else swoop in and claim those tips. Besides, the challenge in his eyes when they'd briefly met mine across the restaurant had sparked something defiant in my chest. He'd looked at me the way rich people always did, like I was part of the decor. Useful, but ultimately beneath notice. I'd spent my entire life being looked at that way, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped caring about the consequences of pushing back. The private dining room was quiet when I entered, my footsteps muffled by carpet that probably cost more per square foot than my apartment's monthly rent. He sat at the head of the table, his attention focused on a leather portfolio that looked like it contained more than just a dinner menu. When I cleared my throat softly, he didn't look up. The deliberate dismissal made my jaw clench. I'd dealt with rude customers before, the ones who snapped their fingers for service, the ones who complained about everything from water temperature to the way you set down their plates. But there was something particularly insulting about being ignored, about being so thoroughly beneath someone's notice that they couldn't even acknowledge your presence. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. He turned a page in his portfolio, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and I had none of it that mattered. The familiar burn of indignation started in my chest, spreading outward like wildfire. This was his restaurant, I'd learn later, his property, his domain. And I was about to insult him in a way that would change both our lives forever. I set the water glass down harder than necessary, the sound sharp enough to finally draw his attention. Those eyes, pale and cold as winter ice, lifted to meet mine with an expression that suggested I'd just made a terrible mistake. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, and I felt the weight of his assessment like a physical thing. He was measuring me, categorizing me, deciding what I was worth. And apparently, the answer was not much. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, but there was an edge beneath it that made my skin prickle with warning. I didn't realize the help was allowed to make noise. The words hit me like a slap, their casual cruelty somehow worse than outright anger. The help. As if I wasn't a person with dreams and bills and a life that mattered just as much as his, regardless of the zeros in our respective bank accounts. I should have smiled. Should have swallowed the insult along with my pride and asked what he'd like to order. Should have done what I'd been trained to do, what I'd done 1,000 times before when customers treated me like I was less than human. But something in his dismissive tone, in the way he'd already returned his attention to his portfolio as if I'd ceased to exist, made the words spill out before I could stop them. Well, I didn't realize customers were allowed to be so rude. But here we are, both learning new things tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched his hand still on the page, watched the muscle in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. When he looked up again, his expression hadn't changed, but something dangerous flickered in those pale eyes. Something that made every survival instinct I possessed start screaming at me to apologize, to back down, to run. But I'd never been good at listening to my survival instincts. He closed the portfolio slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled in a way that suggested violence carefully leashed. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. Beautiful and cold and promising consequences I couldn't begin to imagine. Do you know who I am? The question was asked softly, almost gently, but there was steel underneath. I didn't. At that moment, standing in his private dining room with my heart hammering against my ribs, I had no idea that I'd just insulted one of the most dangerous men in the city. Had no idea that this restaurant, along with half the businesses on this street, belonged to him. Had no idea that people who crossed him tended to disappear in ways that made the evening news, but never led to arrests. All I knew was that I was tired of being treated like nothing by people who thought money made them better than everyone else. So instead of apologizing, instead of showing the deference that might have saved me, I lifted my chin and met his cold stare with one of my own. Should I? Because from where I'm standing, you're just another customer who thinks his wallet makes him special. The words were out before I could fully process their implications, before I could understand the magnitude of my mistake. I watched something shift in his expression, watched calculation replace the initial anger. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under glass. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. There was no humor in it, no genuine amusement. But it was laughter nonetheless, low and dark and somehow more threatening than his anger had been. Around us, I became aware of movement. The door to the private dining room had opened, and two men in dark suits had materialized like shadows given solid form. They didn't say anything, didn't move toward me, but their presence was a threat that needed no words. I'd crossed a line I hadn't known existed, and now I was going to pay for it. "What's your name?" He asked the question casually, as if we were having a Normal conversation instead of whatever this was. As if his men weren't standing behind me, blocking my exit. As if my entire future hadn't just narrowed down to this single moment in this private room with this dangerous stranger. I thought about lying. Thought about giving him a fake name and quitting this job tonight, disappearing into the city's anonymous masses before whatever he was planning could catch up with me. But something in his expression told me he'd find out anyway, and lying would only make things worse. My name's Alice. I kept my voice steady, refusing to show the fear that was turning my insides to ice. Alice Morrison. And you are? His smile widened, and I realized I'd just made another mistake. By asking his name, I'd confirmed that I genuinely didn't know who he was, had proven my earlier defiance wasn't calculated bravery, but actual ignorance. Somehow, that seemed to amuse him more than it should have. I'm the person who decides whether you leave this room employed or in significantly worse condition. He stood, and I was struck by how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the space between us. His men shifted slightly, ready to move if he gave the word. But he held up a hand, stopping them, his attention still fixed on me with that unsettling intensity. You have fire, I'll give you that. Most people don't have the spine to speak to me the way you just did. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my traitorous body respond even as my mind screamed danger. The question is whether that fire is courage or stupidity. I didn't have an answer for that. Didn't know if what I'd done was brave or just catastrophically foolish. All I knew was that I couldn't seem to back down, even now, even with his men behind me and his power obvious in every line of his body. Maybe it's both. The words came out steadier than I felt. Maybe I'm brave enough to be stupid or stupid enough to be brave. I'm not sure there's much difference when you're this far past the point of no return. Something flickered across his face then. Not quite approval, but something close to it. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. As if he saw something in me that resonated with something in himself. He returned to his seat, gesturing for me to sit across from him. It wasn't a request. I sat, my legs grateful for the support even as my mind raced through everything I knew about dangerous situations and how to escape them. Across the table, he watched me with those cold, calculating eyes, and I had the distinct impression that I'd just become something more than an irritating waitress. I'd become a problem he needed to solve. Here's what's going to happen, Alice Morrison. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without question. You're going to finish your shift tonight. You're going to serve whatever customers are assigned to you with the same fire you just showed me, because if you're capable of that kind of courage, fake or real, then you're capable of doing your job excellently. He leaned forward, his pale eyes holding mine with magnetic intensity. And tomorrow, you're going to come back. Not as a waitress, but as someone I want to understand better. Someone who might be useful to me in ways that have nothing to do with carrying plates. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him that I didn't want whatever he was offering, that I just wanted to do my job and go home and forget this night had ever happened. But he raised a hand, silencing me before I could speak. This isn't a request. This is what happens when you insult me in my own restaurant. You don't get fired. You don't get hurt. You get promoted into a position where I can keep an eye on you, where I can determine whether you're an asset or a liability. His smile returned, sharp as broken glass. Consider it the consequence of your bravery, or your stupidity. We'll figure out which one it was together. I should have refused. Should have walked out right then and dealt with whatever consequences came from defying him. But something in his words had hooked into a part of me I didn't like to acknowledge. The part that was tired of serving people, tired of being overlooked and underestimated, tired of living small when everything in me wanted to burn bright and hot and dangerous. What kind of position? I heard myself ask, and knew I'd already lost whatever battle this had been. His smile suggested he knew it too. We'll discuss that tomorrow. For now, get back to work. And Alice? He waited until I met his eyes again. Don't ever mistake my interest for mercy. I don't show mercy. I show curiosity. And when my curiosity is satisfied, then we'll see what you're really worth to me. I stood on shaking legs, aware that I'd just agreed to something I didn't fully understand. As I moved toward the door, his voice stopped me one more time. I didn't catch your last comment. What you said before about wallets and being special. It was clever. Reckless, but clever. I turned back, surprised by what might have been a compliment buried in the criticism. He was watching me again, his expression unreadable. Most people who work for me know better than to question anything I do. They've learned that obedience is safer than honesty. But you spoke truth without fear of consequences. His expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. That's either going to make you very valuable to me, or it's going to get you killed. We'll find out which. I didn't sleep that night. Lay awake in my tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of that conversation. The way he'd looked at me, the casual mention of death as if it were just another business consideration. The strange pull I'd felt toward him despite every rational thought screaming at me to run far and fast. By morning, I'd convinced myself a dozen times not to go back, had mentally drafted my resignation letter, had even started looking at bus tickets to other cities where I could disappear and start over. But when the time came, I found myself standing outside Bellini's again, watching the morning sun paint gold across windows I'd cleaned just yesterday. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Private entrance. Around back. Come alone. The fact that he had my number, that he'd somehow gotten that information in less than 12 hours, should have terrified me. Instead, it just confirmed what I'd already known. I'd caught the attention of someone who didn't let go of things that interested him, someone who had resources I couldn't begin to imagine, and a will that bent the world to his vision. The back entrance led to a hallway I'd never seen before, quiet and carpeted and clearly not meant for staff. At the end, a door stood slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. I pushed it open and found myself in an office that made the private dining room look modest by comparison. He sat behind a massive desk, his attention on multiple screens showing what looked like security feeds from various locations throughout the city. When I entered, he didn't look up immediately, just made me wait, made me stand there in the silence while he finished whatever he was doing. Power play or genuine work, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. Finally, he gestured to a chair across from his desk. Close the door. Sit. I obeyed, hating how easily I followed his commands, how his voice seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to some deeper part of me that recognized authority when it heard it. The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly the room felt smaller, more intimate, despite its size. Do you know what I do, Alice? He asked the question while still looking at his screens, his fingers moving across a keyboard with surprising speed. I mean, really do, beyond owning restaurants and making people nervous. I didn't. Could guess, based on the fear he inspired and the men who surrounded him and the casual way he talked about violence. But guessing and knowing were different things. I think, I started carefully, that you're someone powerful, someone people are afraid to cross. He finally turned to face me, those pale eyes assessing in the morning light. That's not an answer. That's an observation. He stood, moving around the desk to lean against it, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. I run an empire, Alice. Restaurants, yes, but also construction, shipping, security services. I employ thousands of people. I influence elections. I decide which businesses thrive and which ones fail. He paused, letting the words sink in. And I do it all from the shadows. Because the moment people know your name, they think they understand you. They think they can predict you, control you. The way he spoke about power made it clear this wasn't just business to him. It was art. A complex game he played with human lives as pieces on a board only he could fully see. And you want me to do what? Exactly? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Help you run this empire? I'm a waitress. I barely finished community college. What could I possibly offer someone like you? He studied me for a long moment, and I caught something in his expression that looked almost like respect. You offered it last night. Honesty, courage, the willingness to speak truth to someone who could destroy you with a phone call. Do you know how rare that is in my world? Everyone lies to me. Everyone tells me what they think I want to hear. Even my most trusted people filter their words through fear. But you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't special. His smile was sharp. You were wrong, of course. I am special. But the fact that you said it, that you believed it enough to risk everything, that's what I need. Someone who sees me as human rather than a god or a monster. I thought about that, about what it meant to be the person who told truth to power. It sounded noble until you remembered that truth-tellers throughout history usually ended up martyred or exiled or worse. But there was something seductive in his offer. Not just the implied money or power or access to a world I'd only glimpsed through restaurant windows. It was the recognition. The idea that someone saw something valuable in me beyond my ability to carry plates and smile through insults. What happened to the last person who told you the truth? I asked, needing to know what I was really signing up for. His expression darkened. She's dead. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward with implications I didn't want to examine too closely. He must have seen something in my face because he continued, his voice softer but no less intense. Not because she told me the truth, because I failed to protect her from the consequences of being close to me. This world I inhabit, it's dangerous. The people who stand beside me become targets by association. His pale eyes held mine with uncomfortable honesty. I'm offering you an opportunity, Alice, but I'd be lying if I said it came without risks. The question is whether you're brave enough or stupid enough to take it anyway. I should have said no, should have walked out of that office and that restaurant and that entire situation before I got in any deeper. But he was right about one thing. I had fire in me, had spent my whole life trying to contain it, to make myself small and acceptable and safe. And where had that gotten me? 24 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, serving people who looked through me like I was invisible. Maybe it was time to burn. I stood, moving toward the door, feeling his eyes track my movement. When I reached for the handle, I paused, looking back at him over my shoulder. I'll work for you. But not because you intimidated me. Not because I'm afraid of what you'll do if I refuse. I'm doing this because for the first time in my life, someone is offering me a chance to be more than what I was born into. His smile was genuine this time, warm enough to transform his entire face. It reminded me that beneath the danger and the power, he was just a man. A complicated, dangerous, fascinating man. Good. That's the right answer. He returned to his desk, pulling out a folder that he slid across the surface toward me. These are the details of your new position. You'll start Monday. The pay is listed there, along with the expectations and the risks. Read it carefully. Sign it if you still want in. I took the folder, noting the weight of it. The expensive paper that suggested whatever was inside was more than just an employment contract. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me one final time. Alice? One more thing. The protection I offer is absolute, but it comes with absolute loyalty. If you betray me, If you sell my secrets or work against my interests, I won't kill you." His voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute truth. "I'll make you wish I had. That's not a threat. It's a promise. So before you sign that contract, make sure you understand what you're agreeing to, because once you're in my world, there's no going back to who you were before." I left his office with the folder clutched against my chest, stepped out into the morning sunlight that suddenly seemed harsher and less forgiving than it had before. In my hands, I held either my salvation or my damnation, a chance to transform into something powerful and dangerous, or a contract that would slowly consume everything I'd been. The choice was mine. But as I opened the folder and saw the figure listed as my starting salary, more money than I'd made in the last 3 years combined, I knew the choice had already been made. Not by greed, though the money mattered. Not by fear, though I was terrified. But by the recognition that I'd spent my entire life being invisible, and he'd offered me the chance to be seen. That night, I signed the contract in my apartment, my hand steady despite everything it meant. The next morning, I showed up at the private entrance again, no longer a waitress but something else entirely. Something dangerous and uncertain and more alive than I'd felt in years. He was waiting in his office, and when I handed him the signed contract, his smile suggested he'd never doubted I'd return. "Welcome to the Empire, Alice Morrison. Try not to get yourself killed in the first week." The words should have been a joke, but his tone suggested they were practical advice. As he led me deeper into his world, explaining structures and hierarchies I barely understood, I realized I'd done exactly what I'd sworn never to do. I'd traded one form of servitude for another. But at least this time, I'd made the choice with my eyes open. At least this time, I was walking into danger deliberately rather than stumbling into it through ignorance. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. The empire he'd mentioned wasn't metaphorical. Over the next 3 months, I learned exactly how deep his influence ran through the city like roots from an ancient tree. Every business on 5th Street paid him protection money. The construction projects that shaped the skyline required his approval. The police chief called him before making major arrests. The mayor consulted him on policy decisions. He'd built a network of power so complete that nothing happened in the city without his knowledge or permission. My role in this empire was harder to define. Officially, I was listed as a consultant. In practice, I became his truth teller, the person who could look at his plans and point out flaws without fear of reprisal. The one who attended meetings and reported back on who was lying, who could be trusted, who was plotting betrayal. I had no training for this, no background in criminal enterprise or corporate espionage. But I had instincts he valued and a perspective he couldn't get from anyone else in his organization. I saw people as people rather than assets or threats, and somehow that made me invaluable. It also made me a target. The first attempt on my life came 6 weeks after I'd signed that contract. I was leaving his office late one evening when 2 men stepped out of the shadows near my car. They didn't say anything, didn't make threats or demands. Just moved toward me with the kind of purposeful violence that needed no explanation. I'd been trained for this. Sort of. He'd insisted I learn basic self-defense, had assigned me a protection detail I didn't always notice but knew was there. But training and reality were different things. When the first man grabbed my arm, panic blanked my mind of everything except the need to escape. I screamed, fought with the kind of desperate strength that came from pure survival instinct. Managed to break free long enough to run 3 steps before the second man caught me. His hand clamped over my mouth, cutting off my screams. His arm wrapped around my waist, lifting me off my feet. I was being dragged toward a waiting van when the gunshots started. 3 quick cracks that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The man holding me dropped, his grip loosening enough for me to wrench free. The second man was already down, blood pooling beneath him on the concrete. My protection detail materialized from the shadows, 3 men in dark suits who'd been watching the whole time, waiting to see if I could handle the situation before intervening. The leader, a man named Thomas with scars that suggested a violent past, approached me with professional concern. "Are you hurt, miss?" I wasn't. Physically, I was fine, but psychologically, I'd just crossed another line. Had just been present for my first killing, even if I hadn't pulled the trigger myself. The bodies on the ground were there because of me, because I'd become important enough to kill, because I was no longer invisible. He arrived within minutes, his car screeching to a halt in the parking lot. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine fear in his pale eyes. Fear for me, I realized. Fear that his failure to protect his truth-teller would cost him something he'd started to value beyond her usefulness. "Are you hurt?" He repeated Thomas's question, but with an intensity that made it mean something different. His hands were on my shoulders, my face, checking for injuries with a thoroughness that felt almost intimate. I shook my head, unable to form words yet. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving me shaky and cold despite the warm evening. He pulled me against his chest, his arms wrapping around me with surprising gentleness. "You're safe now." His voice was soft against my hair, but I could hear the rage beneath it. "I promise you're safe. But the men who sent them won't be. Not after what they tried to do to you." He pulled back to look at me, his pale eyes blazing with cold fury. "Do you understand what this means, Alice? Do you understand what them targeting you says about how much power you've gained in just 6 weeks?" I understood. Understood that I'd become important enough to kill. Understood that my value to him had made me valuable to his enemies. Understood that the life I'd chosen came with consequences I'd only intellectually grasped until this moment. "Take her home." He addressed Thomas without looking away from me. Full detail. "I want someone on her floor, someone in the lobby, someone watching the street. If anyone even looks at her wrong, I want to know about it." Then he looked at me again, his expression softening slightly. "Tomorrow, you're moving. I've already arranged an apartment in a secure building. Better protection, better location, better everything. You'll be safe there in ways you can't be in your current place." I started to protest, started to say I didn't want to be relocated like a chess piece on his board. But he pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me. "This isn't negotiable. Someone tried to kill you tonight. That means the game has changed. That means I need to change my strategies to keep you alive." His thumb traced across my cheekbone, a gesture that felt too intimate for what we were. "You're too valuable to lose." The way he said valuable made it clear he meant something beyond my professional usefulness. Something had shifted between us over the past 6 weeks. Something neither of us had acknowledged, but both of us felt. The late nights in his office. The way his eyes tracked me across rooms. The casual touches that lingered longer than professional contact required. We were circling something dangerous, and tonight had pushed us closer to its edge. I moved into the new apartment the next day. It was beautiful in the way that money made things beautiful. Clean lines and expensive furniture and views that showcase the city like a personal kingdom. But it was also a cage, however gilded. The security was so tight I couldn't sneeze without someone noting it in a log. My freedom, already limited by my association with him, contracted further. He visited that evening, appearing at my door with takeout from a restaurant I recognized as one of his properties. Peace offering. His smile was almost sheepish, an expression I'd never seen on him before. "I figured you hadn't eaten, and I wanted to make sure you're settling in okay." We ate in my new living room, the city lights spreading out beyond the windows like scattered diamonds. He was different here, away from his office and his empire, more relaxed, more human. The conversation drifted from business to personal. He told me about growing up in this city, about inheriting an empire he'd never asked for when his father died, about the weight of living up to a legacy built on violence and power. I told him about growing up poor, about dreams deferred because survival took precedence, about feeling invisible in a world that only valued people with money or power or beauty. "You're not invisible anymore." His voice was quiet, intense in the dim light. "You haven't been invisible since the moment you walked into my dining room and refused to be diminished. I saw you then, Alice. Really saw you. And I haven't been able to stop seeing you since." The admission hung between us, heavy with implications we both understood. This was crossing a line, mixing business with something else, something that could complicate everything we'd built. I should have pulled back, should have maintained professional distance, should have done anything except lean forward and close the distance between us. But I'd never been good at doing what I should. His lips met mine with a hunger that suggested this had been building since that first night. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened into something that erased every rational thought. This was dangerous. More dangerous than the men who'd tried to kill me, because this could destroy us both from the inside. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, his forehead rested against mine. "This is a terrible idea." His voice was rough, strained. "I'm your boss. You work for me. There are power dynamics that make this complicated and potentially destructive." "I know." But I didn't pull away, didn't create the distance we both knew we needed. "Tell me to stop." His hand cupped my face, his thumb tracing across my lips. "Tell me this crosses too many lines and I'll walk out that door right now. We'll pretend this never happened and go back to being professional." I couldn't form the words that would send him away. Because despite everything, despite the danger and the complication and the absolute certainty that this would end badly, I wanted this, wanted him, wanted to feel something real in a world that had become increasingly surreal. So instead of telling him to stop, I kissed him again. And this time, he didn't hesitate, didn't give me another chance to reconsider, just lifted me into his arms and carried me toward the bedroom, crossing every line we'd both known existed but chosen to ignore. What happened that night changed everything between us. We couldn't go back to purely professional, couldn't pretend there wasn't something electric that sparked whenever we were in the same room, but we also couldn't fully acknowledge what we were becoming. He was still the dangerous man who'd threatened me that first night. Still the empire builder who solved problems with violence. Still someone whose enemies would use me against him given any chance. And I was still the truth teller. Still the person who pointed out his flaws and questioned his decisions. Still someone who refused to be diminished even by the man I was falling for. We existed in this strange space between lover and employee, between equal and subordinate, between danger and desire. It was unsustainable. We both knew it, but neither of us could seem to walk away. Over the next 2 months, I learned what it meant to be important to someone powerful. The gifts that appeared without warning, the way doors opened before I reached them, the subtle shift in how people treated me once they understood I mattered to him. But I also learned the cost, the constant security, the way I could never truly be alone, the knowledge that every choice I made affected not just me, but him and everyone connected to his empire. And through it all, I kept doing my job, kept attending meetings and spotting lies, kept being the person who told him truths nobody else would dare speak. Our relationship, complicated as it was, made me better at my role, because I understood him in ways his other employees couldn't, understood the weight he carried, the loneliness of power, the way violence was sometimes necessary but never easy. The second attempt on my life came on a Tuesday morning. I was in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my secure apartment, having finally convinced my security detail to let me have 30 minutes of normalcy. The bomb was small, designed for precision rather than mass destruction. It detonated the moment I sat down at my table, sending me flying backward in a wave of heat and sound and shattering glass. I woke up in a private hospital room with him sitting beside my bed. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but his hand holding mine was gentle. When he saw my eyes open, something shifted in his expression, relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You're awake. Thank God you're awake." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought." He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. I hurt everywhere. Burns on my arms and face, broken ribs from the impact, cuts from the flying glass. But I was alive, which apparently surprised everyone, including the doctors. "Your security guard threw himself over you. He saved your life." The cost in his voice made it clear what that sacrifice had meant. Thomas died protecting me. The realization hit harder than any physical pain. A man had given his life, for mine. Not because he knew me or cared about me personally, but because I'd become important to someone powerful, because protecting me was his job. "I'm sorry." I started, but he cut me off. "Don't. Don't apologize for living. Don't apologize for mattering." He leaned forward, his pale eyes holding mine with burning intensity. "This is my fault. I brought you into this world. I made you a target. I failed to protect you properly." The guilt in his voice was raw, unfiltered. The self-recrimination of a man who'd built an empire on control, finding himself unable to control the one thing that had come to matter most. "I'm done, Alice. Done letting you be exposed like this. Done pretending we can continue the way we've been. When you're healed, when you can leave this hospital, you're disappearing. New identity, new city, new life. Everything you need, all the money you could want, but completely separate from me and my world." I stared at him, processing what he was saying. He was ending this, ending us, sending me away for my own protection. It was logical, practical, the smart thing to do given how many times people had tried to kill me, but it also felt like abandonment, like being told I mattered only to be pushed away. "No." The word came out weaker than I intended, my voice still rough from smoke inhalation. "You don't get to make that decision for me. I'm not asking permission." His voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to heal, and then you're going to disappear. And you're going to live a long, safe, normal life somewhere I can't touch you." His hand tightened on mine. "Because I can't lose you, Alice. I can't watch another person I care about die because they were foolish enough to stand beside me." I understood then. Understood that this wasn't about not wanting me. It was about wanting me too much. About caring enough to let go rather than watch me die. About choosing my safety over his happiness. It might have been noble if it wasn't also infuriating. I don't want safe. My voice was gaining strength, fueled by anger and pain and desperation. I don't want normal. I chose this world. Chose the danger. Chose you. You don't get to unchoose it for me just because keeping me alive is difficult." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window with the kind of barely restrained violence I'd learned to recognize. "You were almost killed today, Alice. Blown up by people who see you as nothing more than a way to hurt me. Thomas died. 3 customers in that coffee shop died. All because you were there. All because being close to me makes you a target." His voice was harsh with self-loathing. "How many more people need to die before you understand you can't stay? Then let me help make decisions that keep people safe." I pushed myself up despite the pain. "Let me be part of solving this instead of just being protected from it. You brought me into your world because I told you truths you needed to hear. So hear this truth now. Sending me away doesn't solve the problem. It just makes you feel better about your inability to protect me." The words were harsh, but they cut through his guilt enough to make him turn and really look at me. "You don't understand what you're asking. Being truly part of this world, not just an advisor but an active participant, it changes you, makes you capable of things you never thought possible." His pale eyes held mine with terrible honesty. "I don't want that for you. Don't want to watch you become hard and cold and willing to order deaths like you're ordering dinner. Too late." The words came out softer than intended. "I'm already changing, already capable of things I never thought I'd do. You can't protect me from what I'm becoming, because I chose this transformation. Chose to burn bright instead of living small and safe." His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to track. Anger, fear, resignation, and something that might have been respect. "If you stay, truly stay, you need to understand what that means. You need training beyond basic self-defense. You need to learn how this world really works, not just observe it from the outside." His voice was hard but honest. "You need to be willing to make impossible choices and live with the consequences." I nodded, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "That's what I'm asking for. Not protection. Not rescue. Partnership in the only way that makes sense in your world." He returned to my bedside, his hand gentle on my face despite the violence I knew those hands were capable of. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish. I suspect it's both." I smiled, despite everything. "You said something similar the first night we met. Seems like we keep having the same conversation. Then maybe it's time we stop talking and start doing something about it." He leaned down, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that tasted like promise and danger and tomorrows that were far from guaranteed. When the kiss ended, he rested his forehead against mine. "All right. You can stay. You can be part of this. But on my terms. Full training, complete integration into the organization. You stop being just an advisor and become what you should have been from the beginning. My partner in everything, including the darkness." It was what I'd been asking for, what I'd risked everything to achieve. So why did it feel like I'd just sold the last piece of my soul? Because becoming his partner meant becoming like him, meant accepting that violence was sometimes necessary, meant making peace with the blood that would inevitably stain my hands, meant transforming completely from who I'd been into who this world required me to be. Over the next 6 months, I learned exactly what that transformation required. Weapons training until I could shoot with accuracy that surprised even the instructors. Strategy sessions where I learned to think 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Meetings where I watched him order deaths with the same calm he used to order dinner. And slowly, inevitably, I found myself doing the same. The first time I authorized violence, it was a man who'd been embezzling from one of our operations. The traditional response would have been to make an example of him. Brutal, public, designed to discourage others from similar theft. But I suggested a different approach. Find out why he was stealing. I'd looked at the man's file, seen the medical bills for a sick daughter. Addressed the underlying cause instead of just punishing the symptom. He'd listened, surprisingly, had covered the daughter's medical expenses and given the man a chance to make restitution. It had cost more money but built more loyalty than violence ever could. That was the kind of partner I tried to be. Someone who found solutions beyond bloodshed when possible. But I learned quickly that sometimes violence was the only language certain people understood. The rival organization that kept pushing into our territory. The traitor who'd sold information that got 3 of our people killed. The politician who'd taken our money then turned against us. For those situations, I learned to be as cold and calculating as he was. Learned to authorize actions that would have horrified the waitress I'd been a year ago. Learned that power required a willingness to use it, even when the use was dark and terrible. And through it all, Our relationship deepened into something that transcended simple categories. We were lovers, partners, friends, allies. We finished each other's sentences in meetings. We anticipated each other's needs without words. We became the kind of unit that made his organization stronger and his enemies more cautious. But we also fought. Spectacular arguments that shook the walls of his office and made his employees scatter. Because I never stopped telling him truth. Never stopped pointing out when his plans were flawed or his judgments clouded by ego. Never stopped being the person who pushed back even when it was easier to agree. And he never stopped valuing that, even when my truths made him furious, even when I questioned decisions he'd already made, even when I forced him to reconsider courses of action he'd been committed to. He listened because somewhere along the way, I'd become more than his truth teller. I'd become his conscience. 1 year after that first night in the restaurant, we stood together at a groundbreaking ceremony for a community center in the poorest part of the city. It was funded by his money, designed by me using the architecture degree I'd finally completed. A legitimate project that would actually help people, rather than just serving as a front for darker activities. This is what I want our legacy to be. I told him as we watched construction crews begin their work. Not just the empire built on fear and control, but also this: real change, real help, places where people can dream bigger than survival. He pulled me close, his arm around my waist. You've changed me, Alice Morrison. Made me think about impact beyond power. Made me consider that strength can look like building up instead of tearing down. His pale eyes held that familiar intensity. I don't know if that makes me better or just more complicated, but I know I'm different because of you. I leaned into him, watching the sun set over the city we'd both claimed in our own ways. We were dangerous together. Probably more dangerous than either of us alone, but we were also building something that might outlast the violence, might create space for others to dream and grow and become more than their circumstances suggested they could be. The empire endured. The darkness remained. But now there was light too. And maybe that was enough. Maybe being both things, dangerous and hopeful, violent and creative, was the only honest way to exist in a world that demanded complexity. We stood together as equals finally, watching our future take shape in concrete and steel and possibility.